Hi, this is Julia, and I want to share with you some of the creepiest true life experiences I've had. I'm a nurse, besides my YouTube personality, and these are actual events that have happened in my nursing years. Starting with this story, when I first started nursing, I nursed in a nursing home in the Blue Mountains. Now, I won't be mentioning which hospitals I have worked at for legal reasons, and some of the names of the patients have been changed also for legal reasons. But I worked in a nursing home in the Blue Mountains, loved my job. I was an enthusiastic young nurse that came to work, loved working with the elderly people and hearing their life stories. But one night, I shall call her Mabel, acted very strangely. She kept saying there was a woman in her room reaching out. At first, I didn't know what to say, but she insisted there was a woman in her room, and this woman was creepy and reaching out to her. So I spoke to the nurse in charge. Mabel says there's a woman in her room. She's very adamant. She's acting very strangely tonight. And the head nurse said, look, a lot of our patients have dementia, Julia, so don't worry about it. Maybe even go along to humour her. So getting her ready for bed, I made sure that her buzzer was next to her bed, made sure her pillows were fluffed, and as always, I used to talk to them and try and make them feel comfortable in their environment. And I said, Mabel, is that woman still in your room? She said, yes, please, please, nurse, get her out, get her out, get her out. I see her, she's reaching out. She looks so evil. I said, Mabel, what does she look like? She said, she looks like death. Now in the morning, when nurses came on duty to do their rounds to check on the patients, Mabel was in her bed, but she was stone dead. I don't know who this woman was in her room that night, but I can only imagine something awful, something creepy may have scared her so badly that she died in her sleep, or worse still, came to collect her to the other side. You be the judge. A few years later, I started working at the general hospitals in Sydney, and this one particular hospital I worked at was extremely haunted. I worked night duty a lot while the kids were growing up, and you would often hear some strange noises or footsteps behind you, or even I'd see in the corner of my eye look like a patient was out of bed and walking at a distance down the end of the long corridor, and I would go down there to investigate, only to find everybody was in bed. There was nothing wrong. There were strange lights. One particular light, the building was an older hospital and it had a veranda around the perimeter of the building, and there would be a strange light. It looked like there was a light on the balcony and it was shining in one of the rooms. So I would look into that particular room only to find all the patients in there asleep, no lights on, and no light on the balcony. So then I'd think maybe it's in the next room. So then I'd do that and go into that room only to find that there was no light. The room was empty, or it had patients asleep, and there was no source for light. This was a puzzle that I could never solve. And it did not happen all the time, but it happened frequently. And I did find out later that a patient had jumped off the balcony to his death. So could that be in relation to that light? I'll never know. But I can tell you a couple of other creepy things that happened there. There'd be strange pinprick lights. that would just appear out of nowhere. The room would get really, really cold, and sometimes I would see those lights flashing over patients as they slept, and not long after, those patients would die. And there was the buzzer room that would light up, and there was no patient in that room, so there'd be buzzers going off for no reason at all. And one poor nurse, my colleague, went to have her break in the middle of the night and went to the TV room because it was empty. Thought it would be a nice place to go and sit down and shut her eyes for a few minutes, and she felt a cold hand against her forehead holding her down, and she tried to put her head up to see who it was, thinking someone was playing a trick, but there was no trick and there was no one else in the room. She was so frightened she said the Lord's Prayer, and then once she said that, the hand was removed, but she never went into that room again at night. That same poor nurse was on night duty and was told to go into an empty room and have a lie down, as she was very tired on her break, which she did, and pulled the curtain around her bed to, give her some privacy. There was no one else in the room. That was an empty room. Suddenly, the curtain went flying around the bed. She sat up quickly, thinking that we were playing a joke on her. So she came out to the nurse's station and said, "Okay, fun's up. So who is it?" And we didn't know what she was talking about. She was so surprised, as were we, that she'd had that experience. And I'll never be able to explain the strange lights, or the room getting cold, or the strange light on the balcony, or the footsteps, or the buzzers going off for no reason. I'll let you decide. I was working at this same hospital, but in a different ward. This ward was a palliative ward, so the people that were patients there had a terminal illness, and they usually didn't live longer than 3 weeks. And this one particular night, as I did night duty, I did my rounds, walking around the wards, and in one room where there was 2 patients fast asleep. Now let me add that these patients were bedridden. They could not get out and walk. They couldn't even go in a wheelchair. Well, we weren't expecting them to live long. The shower turned on in their ensuite all by itself. Now when we went to investigate, what made it worse, the shower head was turned towards the door, so if you entered the ensuite, you would have got sprayed with water, but it was scalding hot water. We couldn't go in there to turn the shower off, and the patients couldn't talk. They were very ill, in their last stages. The only way we could turn off that shower was to call the hospital security to come down and wear a rubber apron and go in there and turn it off. They were lever handles, but we do not know how, in the middle of the night, how a shower would turn on, face the door with scalding hot water. This is a true story, true events that I have experienced in my years of nursing, and I still have no explanation for that night. Now this next story is not of my own, but of a work colleague I was once close to, and I shall name her Sandy. We both worked together for a nursing agency, and we often was sent out to different hospitals and bumped into each other in the wards and worked together, and we formed a close relationship. Now I noticed she wasn't taking shifts anymore in a palliative ward in an inner Sydney hospital. And when I asked her about it, she didn't want to talk about it straight away. But after a few weeks of me seeing if she was okay and talking to her, she felt she could confide in me. Now this is where the story gets horrifying. She worked in a palliative ward, and all of these patients were terminally ill. And there was only a small ward of 20 people. We both worked there before. But this one night she was called in to do night duty, and she had 6 people pass away in the middle of the night. The nurse in charge, can I say, was a little unhinged. And we normally lay them out, and we would wait in the morning for the doctor to sign their death certificate, and then we would take them down to the mortuary. But he decided to sit them up and play creepy classical music to them all. My friend came from a different culture and asked him if he could please at least have her shut the doors, as she felt a little disturbed at seeing the bodies in the wards sitting up in bed looking at her with, sightless eyes, grimace on their faces, mouths wide open, gaping. And he said, nonsense, they're listening to the music. And he turned the music up even louder. So she spent the night walking around, and everywhere she turned there was gaping mouths, soulless eyes. Indeed, a night of terror. She never went back there to work. She refused to work there, and she even stopped nursing after that. It really traumatised her. My next story, I worked as a while after the hospitals as a home care nurse, and I would look after elderly people or disabled people in their own home. And one person I looked after, we'll call her Nonna. She was a sweet old Italian lady, very much loved by her family, and they lived in a 2-story house. Nonna couldn't walk much anymore or climb stairs, so they had her bedroom downstairs where she had her own bathroom, and so at night, so they could hear her if she needed any help, they kept a baby monitor next to her bed. Nonna was a sweet lady, couldn't speak English anymore, and I would try and keep her company by watching her favourite shows and trying to cook her favourite pasta dishes. But her daughter and I knew that Nonna didn't have much longer to go, and we tried to keep her as comfortable as possible and as happy as possible. But one morning I came to work and her daughter was very disturbed, and I said, "What's wrong?" And she said that in the middle of the night she woke up, she heard 2 men talking in loud voices through the baby monitor. She thought that someone had broken into her house and that her mum was in great danger. So she ran down the stairs and looked in the room to find her mum fast asleep and no one in the house downstairs. Puzzled, she went back to bed, but she heard the voices again. So this time she went down, this time very, very quietly in case someone was hiding from her, and turned on all the lights, looked through all the house, and there was no one, absolutely no one in the house. Her daughter could never understand what those voices were or who they were, but or that the fact that there was no one in the house. But she did tell me later that her father and her brother were both passed away and in the afterlife, and not long after that event with the voices, Nonna died. So we're wondering, could it be the brother and the father coming to take her over to the other life, to live in heaven with them. If you believe that, let us know your thoughts in the comments, or if anything similar has happened to you. The next story I'm about to tell you was told to me by my father, who worked as a post-mortem assistant in a mortuary in Sydney. Now, part of his role, besides assisting the doctors with their autopsies, was to, when he came in the morning, check the bodies against the register of who had been brought in to make sure all the details were correct, all the body markings, anything that had been brought in with the body were there and registered and documented. And he came into work as usual one morning, and there had been a person that had just passed away not long ago, a man. He was on a trolley covered in a sheet with his hand out. Dad examined him against the documentation that he had and noticed with his hand, his finger moving ever so slightly. My dad at first thought it might have been a trick of the light, or maybe his imagination, so he checked again. The body was cold, the person was cold, but his finger was moving ever so slightly. Dad thought this is very strange, not used to bodies doing this, so he called for the doctor to come and re-examine the body. The doctor came reluctantly, thinking I've already given the death certificate, so probably thought my father was quite mad, and came down and, with my dad's insistence, re-examined the person on the slab. His finger had moved ever so slightly again, and with the second examination they found a pulse, a very weak one, but a definite pulse. If Dad hadn't called for help and got this gentleman re-examined, he would have been put in the mortuary freezer like all the other bodies and would have most certainly died. But thanks to my dad's quick eye, he survived. And you could only imagine the horror of waking up in a morgue, or worse still, being frozen to death. But that's a true story. So the next story I'm going to let Jason tell you, because it's a true encounter experience he has had when he worked as a security guard in a mental hospital.
As a security guard working at a mental hospital, you get told that you have to walk around the buildings and check all inside the wards, make sure you got no homeless people or anybody inside the buildings, because there shouldn't be anybody. As we're walking around in one of the buildings, it got to be known as the Screaming Building, and we used to hear a lady scream, and multiple times we checked the building knowing that there was nobody inside. As time went on, we got used to it when it used to go off at midnight, 12 o'clock every night. One night I was training a guard to learn how our patrols were, you know, in and out of buildings, and, you know, look for homeless or people who might have used to been in a mental hospital might be there. As time went on, the time was getting closer to midnight, and I told the guard, okay, we're going to go to this building now. Me being me, I didn't let on that there'd be screaming going on. And we approached the building. I hopped out of the car. I told him, okay mate, we've got to get out and we're going to have a look inside this ward. Right on key, midnight, we hear this lady screaming. The poor guard looked at me and I looked at him, and I wasn't letting on what was going on. And he said, we've got to have a look. I said, yes we do. So I handed him the keys and said, let's go and have a look. So he's 3 steps ahead of me and I'm about 1.5 steps behind him. He's gone in, straight up and down the ward, looking for somebody with a torch going, trying to find who was in the building. Didn't find nobody. And he's looked at me in a real wonderful look, that confused look you can imagine. And I'm sitting there with a bit of a smirk, going, okay, there's nobody in the building. So as we're leaving, heading towards the front door, walking down this corridor, we heard some footsteps running right up behind us. Poor guard spun around, and I turned around, and there was nobody there. So we had to go back, walk up and down the corridors to see if there was anybody in there. And there was nobody there at all. So as we're walking towards the front door, this guard, new guard, was about 5 to 6 steps ahead of me this time, making his way towards the front door, and I'm, making my slow way out. As we got to the front door, we heard another lady scream again, but this time it come up to the other side of the ward. Well, this poor guard, he didn't know what to do. So I said, well, we've got to have another look. And so we went for another walk up and down. Me, I'm probably about 6 steps behind him now, because I'm just starting to smirk. And this poor guard, man, I've never seen a guard as white as him. As we got out, poor guard, we locked the door, did all that. As we got towards the car, another scream happened. And this time the guard said, that's it, I've had it. Jumped in the car, I got in the car, I drove him back to where we would do our office work. This guard literally quit that night because he heard the scream. And it was a pretty interesting thing, because we got used to hearing it that often, that the building was end up being called the Screaming Building. And a lot of guards that we had come through with us, who first started off, they were all told at the end of the night, this is the screaming room. And a lot of guards would not go in the buildings, wouldn't go anywhere near the building. I was basically the only one that would. I went back a few months ago and had a look around, and I think the lady, whoever was screaming in that building, has left. Have you had any experience like that, walking around an old hospital or anywhere like that? Love to hear your stories.
The last story is a true story that I experienced, but not offhand. I was there when it happened. Now, I was working in a ward called a transitional ward, where we have elderly patients that have come in, they've fallen over from home, or they're no longer able to look after themselves, and they're waiting for nursing home placements, and some do have dementia and quite confused. When you're working with these people, you do have to watch them, as sometimes they forget where they are, and being confused, they will try and leave the hospital grounds. And one elderly gentleman patient did just that. He disappeared. We looked for him all over the ward, couldn't find him. We called security for help to look all over the building and the grounds, couldn't find him. We spent several hours doing this, most of the day, and couldn't find him, so we reported him missing to the police. Following morning, however, one of the cleaners came to work, and her storeroom where she kept her equipment was down at the basement. Now, this was also the same floor in the basement that the mortuary is held. And she went, half asleep to her business to go and unlock the storeroom to get her equipment out, and turned around, and there was a man's face looking at her from inside the mortuary door. Well, you can imagine at 5 in the morning how she would have felt. She nearly fainted. Not knowing quite what to say or do, she looked twice. The man's face was still there looking at her. She called for help. Security came down, and funny enough, the gentleman that was quite confused had spent the night wandering around the mortuary, and still confused, he was looking at her through the hospital window, through the mortuary door. And it turned out to be a happy ending, but could you imagine going to work and looking across to the mortuary door and seeing a face looking back at you. I'll keep that thought for you. And I hope you enjoyed these stories. And they're all true. The only proof I have is my memories and Jason's memories. But I hope you enjoyed them. And we want to wish you a very happy Halloween. Keep smiling, stay spooky.